So we are ready to go online. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us from around the world for the SVI-Webinar. I am Hamdan Khan and I work as a research officer at Strategic Green Institute, Islamabad. I will be facilitating today's webinar. The topic for today's webinar is Global Nuclear Order in the Wake of Ukraine Crisis. At the outset, please allow me to brief you about the format of the webinar. We start with a brief introduction of speakers, which will be followed by introductory remarks by Executive Director SVI, Dr. Naeem Salik. Subsequently, we will move on to our working plenary, wherein each speaker will be requested to speak for 12 to 15 minutes. Next, we will open the house for comments and questions. We will appreciate short and crisp comments and questions. Please write down your questions and comments in the given box, and please don't forget to mention to whom the questions and comments are addressed. We will try to accommodate as many of them. Executive Director SVI, Dr. Naeem Salik, will be delivering introductory remarks. Dr. Salik is currently Executive Director at Strategic Green Institute, Islamabad. Dr. Salik holds a PhD degree from University of Western Australia. He has taught at Quaid-e-Azam University, National Defense University, and Air University, Islamabad. He has been a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University and a guest scholar at Brookings Institution. Dr. Salik has also been a visiting fellow at Stanford University and Stimson Center. His areas of expertise include South Asian security, with special reference to Indian and Pakistani policies on nuclear and missile issues, nuclear non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament, nuclear and conventional CBMs, nuclear safety and security, and export controls. Dr. Salik has published 4 books, including 2 edited volumes and several monographs, and has contributed 7 book chapters. His published work also includes over 40 research articles. Given the pressing nature of the topic, we are delighted to have brought together distinguished experts from 3 different continents. For the working plenary, we are joined by Professor Shen Dingli from Fudan University, China. Professor Shen is currently in Hiroshima, Japan, and we are profoundly thankful to him for taking the time despite that it's late evening in Japan. Dr. Shen Dingli is a professor of international relations at Fudan University. He is the founder and director of China's first non-government-based program on arms control and regional security at Fudan University. Dr. Shen's research areas cover the US-China security relationship, nuclear arms control and disarmament, the nuclear weapons policies of United States and China, regional non-proliferation issues concerning South Asia, Northeast Asia, and the Middle East, test ban, missile defense, export control, as well as China's foreign and defense policies. Dr. Shen is a prolific author. He has written and edited nearly a dozen books and has published over 500 articles and papers. Thank you, Professor Shen Dingli, for joining us. We are also joined by Dr. Mariana Budjeryn from Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's early morning on the eastern coast of the USA, and our profound thanks to Dr. Mariana for taking the time. Dr. Mariana is a senior research associate at Belfer Center's project on managing the atom at Harvard Kennedy School. She is the author of a recent book, Inheriting the Bomb, The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, which was published last year. She has previously been a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow and a visiting professor at Tufts University and Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt. Dr. Mariana is a member of Committee on International Security and Arms Control of the National Academies of Sciences. Her research and analytical contributions appeared in Journal of Cold War Studies, Non-Proliferation Review, Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and War on the Rocks. Good morning, Dr. Mariana, and thank you for joining us. Our third speaker is Mr. Dmitry Stefanovich, who joins us from Russia. Mr. Stefanovich is a research fellow with the Center for International Security at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences. His main research interests are strategic weapons and strategic stability, arms control, and the effects of emerging and disruptive technologies. Mr. Stefanovich graduated with honors from Institute of International Relations at the Moscow Engineering Physics Institute with a specialist degree in international relations. Good afternoon, Mr. Stefanovich, and thank you for joining us. With this brief introduction, I pass the floor to Executive Director SVI, Dr. Naeem Salik, for his introductory thoughts. Floor is yours, sir.
Good morning and good evening to wherever you are and whatever time zone you are in. I would like to welcome our very distinguished panel of speakers, and we are very thankful to them for finding time to participate in this webinar. Especially, I am very happy to see Professor Shen Dingli after a long time. Good to see you, Professor, and thank you very much for joining us. Since we have a very distinguished panel of speakers, I will try to restrict my remarks to as brief as possible, so that to keep enough of time for the speakers to share their views with us. The subject is very interesting: evolving global nuclear order in the wake of Ukraine crisis. Basically, Ukraine crisis is one of the recent factors which have just emerged during the last year or so. But the global nuclear order has been evolving for quite some time now, as we have seen that some experts are already telling us that we are on the verge of entering the third nuclear age, which will have characteristics which are very different from the first and the second nuclear age. The first nuclear age, as we know, was the period of the Cold War, which was rather simple equation between the two power blocks, each led by one superpower, the US and the Soviet Union respectively, and with their allied countries under NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So it was easy to imagine the competition, manage it, and it was much more predictable. In the second nuclear age, which emerged after the end of the Cold War, was a rather benign period with improved relations between the formerly antagonistic states, and also there were hopes that we'll have a much more congenial global order. There were also a lot of developments in the field of disarmament by way of START treaties, and there was a hope that the things will continue to improve. However, it was not to be, and in the last couple of decades, things have started seeing a change. First of all, the emergence of the regional nuclear orders, starting with the overt nuclearization of India and Pakistan in 1998, which created a new nuclear equation, which was very different from the great power equation during the Cold War, because these two countries have contiguous borders and with a history of conflictual relationships. There is hardly any warning time, and the missile flight times are anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes. So this is a very different situation, and so this created a problem. And to add to that is the triangular relationship which has emerged in recent years in South Asian region with two distinct dyads, one between India and Pakistan, and the other one between India and China. So this triangular security relationship is far more complicated as compared to the Cold War system we have seen, which was a two-way traffic. And then we saw the emergence of DPRK as in the Korean Peninsula, and there we have this dyad between the US and DPRK. And because of the geographical proximity, obviously China cannot stay immune to what happens on the Korean Peninsula. So this is the yet another triangle. And the third regional triangle is in Europe, where there are NATO allies of the United States, which are under the extended deterrence umbrella of the United States. And then United States very closely linked to this. And the third pole of that triangle is the Russian Federation. All these three regional triangles have linkages with the global triangle, which constitutes the three major global powers, that is United States, Russia, and China. So this is a very complicated situation which has developed at the global level. And to add to the problem is some other negative developments, such as the breakdown of the JCPOA after America's, once America decided to leave this agreement during President Trump's time. And JCPO has since that time not been able to come back to its original level. So the situation in Middle East is also not very stable, and where does it end up is not clear as yet. At the international level, in terms of arms control and disarmament, nothing is going on at the multilateral level at the moment, and the prospects of any disarmament initiatives between the major powers are also non-existent, particularly the last remaining agreement between the two major powers, that is the New START Treaty. There are problems in that also, because it is likely to expire in 2026, and there are no prospects in sight that it would be further extended, or there will be a follow-up treaty to this, because such treaties take a lot of time to negotiate, and we have not seen any beginning of negotiations on any such treaty which could replace the New START. Moreover, Russia has recently decided not to share the information which is required under this treaty to be shared with the other party, that is the United States, which further reduces the credibility of this treaty. So all these are very difficult and complex challenges which we're seeing around the world. And to add to that, we have seen that after the Ukraine conflict, although in my opinion, the Western media coverage of the possibility of any use of nuclear weapons by Russia and Ukraine is highly exaggerated, still it has created fears of a nuclear exchange, which could then involve the other major part, that United States and European partners, and that would be a very dangerous situation. But there has been indirect impact of the Ukraine situation also, because I feel that as a result of this, the dream of having a nuclear-free that Korean Peninsula is now will now always remain a pipe dream, because DPRK is not going to give up its nuclear weapons, because they have experienced the countries which gave up their nuclear weapons programs like Iraq and Libya, what happened to them. And then they have seen what happened to Ukraine. So they are not going to give up. And as a result of that, there have also been some unease in South Korea and Japan. And there was some internal debate on whether or not these countries should have their own respective nuclear capabilities. Although that debate died down, particularly because of that Washington declaration, in which United States reassured South Korea of its nuclear guarantees, and also it has started deploying its nuclear powered submarines at the South Korean ports, to further reinforce their confidence. So at the moment, that debate has died down, but the possibility of such an initiative by these countries, which are technically capable of developing their own nuclear capabilities, cannot be totally ruled out. And similar possibilities can also occur in Europe, where some of the American partners are not really very confident about the continued credibility of US extended deterrence guarantees, and they are technically capable. Also, countries, for instance, like Germany, some of the Scandinavian countries, they might also start reconsidering their nuclear options. So I think I would end here and leave the floor to our speakers to so that we can benefit from the views. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salik, for the valuable insights. I think a very solid foundation for the working plenary has been set. So without wasting any time, we will move to our working plenary. Our first speaker is Professor Shen Dingli from Fudan University. Professor, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate Dr. Salik's kind invitation. And nice to join this event with two other panelists from Harvard and IMEMO. I'm in Hiroshima now for an annual event, which is called Hiroshima Roundtable. This is the 10th annual event. Annually, our grouping discuss nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, etc. And we feel that this year, nuclear war seems not to be a distant likelihood. It's ever possible closing to the world at this time. First, we have good news. January 3rd, last year, the leaders of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council issued a joint statement reiterating what President Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan used to conclude. Nuclear war cannot be won and shared and never be fought. So this is the first time P5 reached this agreement, not only the former 2 nuclear superpowers. And the other good news is during G20 last November in Indonesia, in Paris, the joint statement of the G20 also had a component of this. But unfortunately, given the breaking out of Russia-Ukraine crisis, people heard some signaling from that place that some unconventional weapon may be considered for potential use. This is quite close to the threat of use of nuclear weapon, especially against a non-nuclear weapon state. That upsets the world. I need to clarify that even though I'm Chinese, but I do not speak for my government. So don't take my word as my university's words or my government words. And that kind of signaling to use nuclear weapon or means of that kind to settle international dispute is very upsetting. And sometime this year, again, people heard that Russia suggests to deploy its nuclear weapon on the territory of Belarus. Of course, America used to deploy nuclear weapons in other places outside of its territory, and sometimes may still do so in some of the NATO countries, and brought one SSBN a few days ago to South Korea as a deterrence against North Korea and other potential rivals. But all this kind of deploying nuclear weapon for a while or for a long time outside of their own territory doesn't bode well for regional stability and international security. So how we should handle such kind of developments? In my view, the root cause need to be addressed. Russia is worried about a NATO expansion. NATO has already absorbed Lithuania, Estonia, etc. The three Baltic countries. That makes Russia feels not secure. And Russia is worried about that Finland, Sweden may or have already joined NATO. That would make NATO to have more boundary with Russia. That may potentially stop Russia's further expansion. But Russia is worried that NATO's expansion could stop Russia's expansion. Russia may not think it's due to its own expansion that has created NATO's action. So Russia is worried about NATO's eastward expansion. NATO is worried about Russia's westward expansion. I think first of all, they all have some legitimate concern. Your expansion undercuts my legitimate security. So I need to do something in the name of defense. NATO's welcome as opening of its door is in the name of defense, common defense, collective defense, not for offensive reason. But Russia may view NATO's so-called defensive expansion could potentially undermine Russia's legitimate national security. So they would do something also in the name of defensive expansion, but actually which could be viewed by Ukraine and many countries in the world as not merely a special operation, but a war, an unwarranted war, if not an aggression. So this would make Ukraine probably to regret that it used to be foolish by abandoning the nuclear weapon it has inherited from the then Soviet Union to Russia. And Russia promised never use nuclear weapon against Ukraine. True, Russia has not used nuclear weapon, but Russia has used non-nuclear weapon to use them against Ukraine. And all countries may believe if Ukraine still has nuclear weapon, Russia may not would have that courage to take such adventurous behavior. So Russia's action probably would make countries like India, Pakistan, and North Korea to affirm its view that they will never abandon their nuclear weapon. Once you abandon, you will be far less secure. Of course, Russia would not act to think with that kind of ramification. How we could speak to Iran to observe JCPOA, to have true heart, never to develop a nuclear weapon, despite its right for certain legitimate action for its civilian nuclear program. So they may think twice, and other countries may think twice. So I would say, to settle international dispute through warfare is undesirable, is very harmful, and still after nearly 1.5 years of operation, Russia has been unsuccessful in attaining its objective to stop Ukraine's quest for a NATO membership. So the last summit of NATO has not accepted Ukraine, but Ukraine seems to be ever closer to NATO, as NATO has decided to build a special NATO-Ukraine council rather than a committee to simplify its process to apply for the membership. And NATO say, once this war is over, we would work on it. But before it's over, we would support you. Not because you are a member of NATO, but us, you have been invaded. NATO would lend its hand. So this way, Russia is unable to attain its objective to make a security zone, a buffer zone, in which Russia would not immediately border any NATO country. I think if Vladimir Putin would understand this would be the outcome till this time, he may regret to have launched this so-called special operation. But at the same time, I think the West, even including Ukraine, need to understand the unlimited expansion, even with a genuine heart of common defense, may still create a very chaotic outcome, which harms both Russia and Ukraine. Of course, they would not regret, because this would harm Russia. Russia probably deserves the harm it has brought itself. But why we should not work in a more thoughtful way, having dialogue with Russia, listening to Russia, why Russia would be unhappy to see NATO's ever expansion, possibly eventually to take Ukraine. I'm Chinese. I would refer to our experience of the Korean War. There used to be an inter-Korean war for whatever reason. And the US bombed China's Manchu, our northeastern part of China, for a reason. China issued ultimatum, don't do it, don't bomb our territory. Oh, something strong would happen. US did not expect China would send troops to North Korea. That has made General MacArthur's dream to unify entire Korean peninsula on behalf of South Korea to fail. If the US would not bomb China, that would make China's decision to send armed forces into North Korea more difficult. If the US would not declare, actually not the US declare, the general declares to remove North Korea from the surface of the earth, that would less scare China. China does not want to border a united South Korea with the US troops on the borderline of the Korean side after the Korean would be unified under UN and US flag. And eventually China has attained its objective. But a great war happened. From beginning, we should all work together to prevent the war from happening. Soviet Union should not promote North Korea's bad idea. Why the US uses the UN name to strike back North Korea? US should be very careful not to touch upon China. When China threatened to do something, US need to take the signal seriously, rather than to see China send armed force. So China is worried about, even if North Korea is wrong to invade South Korea, we still don't want to see North Korea to be destroyed and US armed force would border Korean-Chinese border. I think the same logic applies to Russia. Russia does not want to see US armed force to be deployed around Russia's border because Russia's neighbor, a former brother from the Soviet Union, would become a new member of the UN, of the NATO. So US need to be sensible that there should be a self-restraint to do it, unless a certain greater harmonious consensus would be attained between NATO and Moscow. And prior to that, assure without NATO membership, Ukraine is secure, and Russia would not be threatened. That does not give Russia reason. Russia should conduct a special operation, and many believe as an aggression, without some consultation and agreed program. We need to understand and respect Russia. That gives no reason for Russia to be assertive. And Russia need to talk to Ukraine and NATO in a constructive way, so they would buy Russia's idea, not to expand further for a while. I think all failed. Ukraine failed, Russia failed, NATO and the US failed. That serves nobody's interest. So North Korea now is a political reality that serves a buffer between China and South Korea, with which China also established a normal diplomatic relationship. And now Russia, Ukraine, NATO failed to avoid a recurrence of the Korean War. And that war, Ukraine war, is continuing. How to play the spirit of negotiation to make Russia to be willing to withdraw from the occupied land with grace, and how Ukraine should ask Russia to withdraw prior to negotiation, but probably accept not to withdraw from all occupied land, but use negotiation for persuading Russia to withdraw from the rest of the all occupied land. United Nations, China, and all countries who are willing to help should help. After saying that, I would say, never use nuclear weapon to settle international dispute. Nuclear weapons should only be used to prevent other countries from using nuclear weapon against a nuclear weapon possessor. There will be no any other legitimate reason to possess nuclear weapon. Never talk about to use unconventional weapon to threat others for political gain, and then never threat others to develop a nuclear weapon. That would only make a nuclear weapon state insecure. Nuclear weapons state would benefit from non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. But at the same time, they should play the leadership by disarming all or partial stockpile or whatever they already have, to encourage non-nuclear weapon states to keep a nuclear weapon free status. We should de-emphasize the political role of nuclear weapon in international politics, in national defense. All major nuclear weapon states, US, Russia, should be a major leader to tell the world this should be the case, rather than to push the envelope of nuclear weapon in their short-term strategic favor. that would be in the long term harming the country that issues the threat and harming the region and the entire world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for those inclusive comments. Now it's time for Dr. Mariana Budjeryn. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to this webinar. It is my pleasure and honor to weigh in on these very important issues. As you may know, I'm based in the United States, and I'm an American now, but I am originally from Ukraine, so a lot of things we are discussing are very, very close to home. And I thank Professor Dingli for his impassionate entreat and his solidarity with my country in many respects. I'd like to take a step back and think, as a social scientist, we like definitions, right? We like a bit of frameworks for analysis and thinking. And I'd like to propose a way of thinking about what a global nuclear order is, to begin with, as the topic of a webinar, and then suggest ways in which it has been affected by the war in Ukraine, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there are certainly various means of conceiving of a global nuclear order. The way that I like to conceive it, the way that appeals to me, is to think about it as the entire conglomerate of material capabilities, norms, institutions, national and international, that govern the existence of nuclear weapons, their development, their deployment, their use, across in international affairs across the world since 1945, since their emergence on the world stage. And in that sense, I follow Professor William Walker. He's at, I think, St. Andrews, or at least used to be. His framework of a nuclear order, global nuclear order, existing of two subsystems, as it were, two suborders. One is the order of deterrence, right? And one is the order of restraint or abstinence, as he calls it. And the order of deterrence really consists of all of these interlocking dyads, all of the weapons that are being developed, deployed, the military industrial complexes that deliver them in the 9 nations that possess them. There are doctrines and all sorts of meanings and strategies that these states develop for their national security about the use and possession of nuclear weapons. Now, another subsystem is that of restraint. It's a network of international institutions, mostly, that has developed over the last at least 5 decades to control the spread of nuclear weapons, with the suggestion that that control, as it were, would someday end in the abolition of nuclear weapons altogether, right? And at the center of that system is NPT, the non-proliferation regime, as sort of the cornerstone of the system of restraint to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to many more states, but also as sort of a prudent and practical tool to reconcile the system of deterrence and the system of restraint, right? It made accommodation to the fact that nuclear nations did exist at that time when NPT was concluded. It recognized these 5 nuclear nations, right, conditionally, as it were, right, under the condition that they would pursue under Article 6 negotiations in good faith towards the cessation of arms race and complete and total disarmament, right? So there's kind of that qualification there, but really it accommodated the reality of the world, that the 5 nations that developed the weapons before January 1st, 1967, would be, as it were, accepted as nuclear possessors into this world. Now that system has developed. There's, of course, many other institutions. There's the test bans. There's, the IAEA that monitors the use of nuclear material for peaceful purposes, making sure it's not diverted to. So there's, potentially there's a nuclear suppliers group. So there's all these intergovernmental, interstate, and international multilateral institutions that try to do exactly that, to contain the nuclear genie, as it were, and maybe see if it could be put back in the bottle. The latest development in that subsystem is, of course, the conclusion of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the so-called Ban Treaty, which again stresses and envisions this sort of something utopian, something very necessary end goal of getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether. So as we can understand, there are inherent tensions, right, between these two subsystems. They both complement each other in some ways. For instance, it has been said that extended deterrence offered by the United States to its allies is one of the sort of non-proliferation tools, right? It's one of the ways that the United States had dissuaded some of its allies, such as Taiwan and South Korea, possibly Japan, possibly West Germany, although of course it's debatable about the extent of West German nuclear program, but possibly extending nuclear deterrence and extended security guarantee to these allies had prevented them from seeking a nuclear deterrent of their own. So that's a complementary function, right, of deterrence and non-proliferation. But of course, there's kind of a built-in inequality. There's a built-in discriminatory sort of nature of this setup, where some states get to have nuclear weapons and use them for their security, and some states don't. And it's not surprising that some states in the system think of it as unfair, think of it as discriminatory, think of it maybe even as sort of a legacy of some colonial, setup. Although the inclusion of China and Russia into that equation might be a little bit, kind of sway that narrative a bit. In any case, so given that there are these two systems with already built-in tensions in it, what can we see happening now, certainly in the last year and a half? How did the developments in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine rocked that boat? It seems to me that what we're observing in this war is that the system of nuclear deterrence actually works. It holds. Nuclear deterrence holds. It's proving its worth. A year and a half in, over a year, almost a year and a half in, the war is contained on its original theater, which is on the territory of Ukraine, with the original two belligerents, Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Nobody else has joined the fray. The conflict has not really spilled over. We can certainly debate, and there'll be books written about why this is so. But from the evidence I'm seeing at this point is that the fear of nuclear escalation is a very real and legitimate fear. And that is certainly at least a part, and a big part of consideration on the part of the West, and perhaps a part of the Russian Federation, about how to prosecute this war and how to support Ukraine. We know that the United States and NATO allies, those who are providing military and defense support to Ukraine, consider every weapon system very carefully. They limit the end use to exclude any use of these weapons on the Russian territory, right? So there's a lot of care that is given to the provision of military aid, with the view that no NATO ally, certainly not the United States, wants to be a direct party in this war. And again, the fear of nuclear escalation is a big consideration. I'm not saying it's all of it, but it's a big part of it. On the other hand, conversely, a major conflict in Europe has broken out on a territory in the country that is not protected by nuclear deterrence, neither by a deterrent of its own, nor by a deterrent of an ally, extended by an ally. It's a nuclear deterrence vacuum. And in a way, it is not surprising that a major land conventional campaign, the most intense one since the Second World War, would erupt in just such a gray zone, in terms of, not a gray zone, kind of a white zone, as it were, in terms of nuclear deterrence. So these are sort of the evidence and counterfactuals we're seeing. In addition, of course, we see that NATO as a nuclear alliance is being strengthened. Sweden and Finland have moved very quickly to join the alliance and be, in turn, covered by U.S. extended deterrence as a result. And certainly, it's no secret that, Poland's and the Baltic states of the world feel very vindicated about their decision to join the alliance, and their very, very active lobbying in the 90s to join the NATO alliance, and are probably, making those conclusions. Now, the system of restraint, the system of non-proliferation that is ultimately due to lead to abolition, that system has taken a blow. Part of the reason, of course, is Ukraine's own nuclear history, which was mentioned by Professor Dingli. While Ukraine did inherit Soviet nuclear weapons, though that was not a fully fledged nuclear deterrent that Ukraine inherited and did not have control over these weapons. It would have had to complete quite a few steps to establish a full nuclear fuel cycle, and built up the missing links of a fully fledged nuclear weapons program in order to actually benefit from this inheritance, quote unquote. But it did have an option. Ukraine, in addition to the actual weapons, did inherit a huge chunk of the Soviet military-industrial complex, its know-how. There were scientists with clearances in the Soviet bomb project. So it certainly had a very handsome proliferation startup package if it wanted to pursue that option. And it gave up that option. In earnest, it gave up both the weapons and the possibility to develop these weapons in the future by joining the NPT in 1994 as a non-nuclear weapon state in exchange for security in Ukrainian and Russian guarantees. In English, it's assurances of the same document here. Semantics become really important. Recorded in the Budapest Memorandum. Now, the Budapest Memorandum is, of course, now a very infamous document in Ukraine in particular. It is viewed as sort of a worthless piece of paper that, one of the signatories basically breached without any consequence. But I have been arguing that the Budapest Memorandum was a very important part of post-Soviet settlement and a constitutive part of a broader non-proliferation regime, right? Because the territorial disputes, as it were, or territorial questions about post-Soviet Ukraine are not new. They're not new to 2014. The question of Crimea became an issue very early on in the 90s, in 92 and 1993, and there was a real threat of Russian-supported separatism there, and of course, for many historical reasons, supported by a large part of the population. We never know if it's an actual majority, right? Because a legitimate and open and legal kind of vote has never taken place there. But basically, the Budapest Memorandum was an agreement about these borders, that these borders shall stay unchanged in exchange for Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, right? So it was part of this post-Soviet settlement where the signatories agreed that these shall be the borders. So it's not just an assurance or a pledge not to attack Ukraine with nuclear weapons. That comes as part of general security assurances, negative and positive under the NPT to any non-nuclear state party to the NPT system. But it contained assurances not to breach Ukrainian borders, to recognize its territorial integrity, and so forth. So the breach of the Budapest Memorandum has all these ripple effects, right, across the entire system. Both the system of non-proliferation, as we know, international institutions are very difficult to build and very easy to damage. There isn't an enforcement mechanism, so they rest on credibility, right? And rocking that boat will have its kind of consequences down the line. There are other indirect ways in which the war in Ukraine is inflicting damage to the non-proliferation regime. One is the poor prospects of arms control, right? The poor prospects of delivering on the Article 6 commitments to pursue arms control in good faith. Now we're re-examining, and my co-panelist, Dmitry, Stefanovich, and I are in this track 2 dialogue that tries to brainstorm, some solutions in lieu of a prospect of maybe a legally binding arms control agreement or treaty between Russia and the United States to limit, and maybe reduce nuclear weapons. And a lot of the ideas are non-treaty based solutions, right? And risk reduction. That is also arms control. But I think globally and internationally, the expectations of what constitutes a deliverable under Article 6 has been raised by the existence of this very solid treaty-based architecture, starting with INF, and then with INF treaty, then with the series of START treaties, the START process that got sort of extended over the years through, START 1, START 2, SORT, and finally New START. And that process seems to have really dim prospects right now, right? The countries are barely on speaking terms, let alone pursuing, very arduous and involved negotiations somewhere in Geneva on the follow-on treaty to START. So we can expect the people who were already, even before this war, faulting the nuclear states for not delivering on their arms control commitments, see even less progress, right? And that is going to, again, undermine the integrity and the credibility of the non-proliferation regime. And finally, the last bit in this system of restraint is the increased role, right, of nuclear weapons that this war has suddenly brought to the fore. For a long time, especially after the end of the Cold War, we sort of thought that these things were dinosaurs. Maybe certainly not in South Asia context, perhaps. That just nuclearized in the 90s. But it seemed that in international politics, maybe the role of nuclear weapons is diminishing. And this war proved that no, these things are really still very important. Now they're deployed to Belarus by the Russian Federation. Again, it's not against any treaty obligations, not against the NPT, but it is against the spirit of trying to, put the genie back in the bottle, as it were. The loose talks about nuclear threats, right? And we can say that maybe early on the allusions to nuclear weapons and Russia's nuclear prowess emanating from the Kremlin were perhaps deterrent threats. They were aimed at the West to try to say, do not get involved, right? So those might be a coercive or deterrent threats. Then in September and October last year, they became more expansive. The threat to use all means to defend sovereign, the territorial integrity of sovereign territory, or whatever the formulation was in the September either 21st or 28th statement by Russian President Putin, suggested that might cover actual territory of illegally annexed parts of Ukraine, of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts. So that that goes way beyond even Russia's doctrinal prescriptions for allowed use of nuclear weapons, and we're left kind of double guessing exactly what the Russian leadership meant and so forth. And of course, there's other people outside of Kremlin, but still representatives of the Russian defense elites, right, that have written rather hair-raising things about nuclear weapons, such as, or the use of nuclear weapons, suggesting that might be permissible. And so put together, you know, what is the lesson here? What is the future here? We have taken a huge step back in trying to advance, you know, a diminished role of nuclear weapons in international security. How that will reverberate across the entire global nuclear order, we don't know for sure. Let's be humble about our power prediction, as it's predictions are always difficult, especially about the future. But the future is long, right? These effects will play out in the long durée. Perhaps today we cannot see, you know, an immediate wave of proliferation taking place because everyone thought, oh, look what happened to Ukraine, and we better rush to you know, acquire nuclear weapons for ourselves. There are formidable obstacles for that to happen easily in many parts of the world, but I think there are countries in the Gulf that are watching this very carefully. There might be other states that find themselves in that kind of security vacuum without you know, a guarantee by a nuclear state, without a security guarantee by a nuclear state, but threatened by a larger, you know, more powerful neighbor that might consider a nuclear option. And right, and in the end, you know, we will have to do a lot more work as a community of experts that are trying to ensure that the nuclear world, that our world does not get destroyed in a nuclear Armageddon, to again try and scale down the role of nuclear weapons in international affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mariana, for those insightful thoughts. Now it's time for Mr. Dmitry Stefanovich. So, Mr. Stefanovich, floor is yours. Please unmute yourself and you can continue.
Yes, thank you. It's a great honor to be part of this webinar, and I've listened with great interest to both the introductory speech and to remarks by my co-panelists, whom I greatly respect. Probably not to repeat some of the points that were already made,
Sir, your connection
would somewhat react to... Sorry?
It disrupted a bit, so probably if you can repeat the sentence that you uttered, yes.
Oh yeah, I say I probably would not repeat the same points that were already made by my colleagues, but react to some of the stuff they said. Apart from one thing, I totally agree with Dr. Budjeryn that nuclear deterrence works, and this is what we saw during the conflict in Ukraine. There is a lot of discussions on that in Russia and elsewhere, whether nuclear deterrence works, what is the purpose of it. But I'm in the camp of people who support the fact that nuclear deterrence works. But we should remember that nuclear deterrence is not a magic wand or a silver bullet that can solve all our security problems. It's much more complicated than that. What else I would like to say on Budapest Memorandum? I would just remind everyone that it was not only about Ukraine, it was also about Belarus. And
so again, there is
the way Belarus was treated. Sorry?
You can continue. There was a disruption, but you can continue. Sorry for interrupting you.
Okay. Yeah. So probably one of the reasons that nuclear weapons, the Russian nuclear weapons, are being moved to Belarus is basically the concerns of Minsk about their security. And I would emphasize that the Minsk played as big a role in moving these nuclear weapons as Moscow, or probably even bigger. Then about nuclear weapons being dinosaurs before war fighting in Ukraine started, perceived as dinosaurs. I'd say that actually things changed earlier than that. I believe major global and local interest in the way nuclear weapons are planned to be used, can be used, the way they affect the national and international politics. This became a major topic after the. It is quite a challenging document with lots of questionable points, but credit where credit is due. suddenly a lot of people understood that, well, nuclear weapons are here, and there are people who are planning, who are thinking about their use, about their modernization, and things like that. I believe it was very important stuff, and also it was definitely was one of the drivers for Russia to become more transparent about nuclear doctrine, for Russia publishing the basic principles of state policy and nuclear deterrence. Hopefully, China will also follow suit and become more, more sophisticated, provide a more detailed overview of nuclear doctrine than only claims about no first use and non-mating of nuclear warheads to their delivery vehicles, which is questionable. What else to say? The whole Ukrainian warfighting started because of a rather primitive but working concept of security dilemma. Whenever one side invests in their military capabilities, which are always labeled as defensive, other sides perceive it as a challenge, perceive it as a possible threat to their security. And in a terminal situation, we end in an actual hot war with what we see right now. Have there been a chance to avoid it, as my co-panelists said? Well, I'm absolutely sure that there is always a chance to avoid war, but everyone involved should take an extra mile. But this is not a topic of our discussion, so I won't waste more time on that. My only point would be that to come back to, well, not to come back, to actually resolve this crisis and come back to discussions on nuclear arms control, on nuclear reductions, we will need to solve a lot of adjacent issues. And whether fortunate or not, or the issue of a broader rearrangement, broader resolution of issues of critical questions which exist between Moscow and Washington, Moscow and Brussels, is of paramount importance. So the nuclear part probably will be a part of a broader resolution. It's not yet clear how it might work out, but I believe the draft documents that were published by the Russian Federation in late 2021, the so-called security guarantees documents, as well as a draft treaty that was more or less agreed upon between Russia and Ukraine and Istanbul in spring 2022. This might be not a blueprint, but a starting point of a future resolution, given that the situation on the ground is much different in Europe and in Ukraine. What else to say here? Conflict, yes, it does exist. It is a reality that we need to understand. Yes, there are very questionable remarks and articles and statements being put forward by some analysts in Russia and even by some official or semi-official people. But on the official side, the Gorbachev-Reagan statement reapproved by the P5 remains relevant, and Russia also signed, as well as many other countries, with the G20 statement on non-acceptability, or I might use the wrong word, of nuclear threats per se. It is, to my understanding, it is somewhat questionable choice of words, because basically nuclear deterrence is based on nuclear threats, but nevertheless it shows that there is interest in somewhat limiting the that last autumn there was a very explicit statement by the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs on preventing nuclear war, and also despite the sad but somewhat understandable fact of the Russian attitude towards New START, and the treaty is put on hold. The limits are still being upheld. The identifications with the relevant treaties are being used. And actually, another old treaty on prevention of nuclear war from 1973 also remains a reality. It is another topic how useful such treaties are, but still as a sign of a commitment to, well, not going into, not engaging in nuclear war fighting, it remains somewhat relevant. On extended deterrence, this is actually a topic of growing importance. And while of empirical evidence that extended deterrence prevented some countries from developing nuclear weapons, like Germany or like South Korea, at least so far, there somewhat another trend is being to develop, and it is manifested in documents and in operationals, that the non-nuclear weapons, non-nuclear capabilities of US allies somewhat augment and support their nuclear deterrence missions and possibly nuclear operations. This is increasingly true not only for the US, but with the situation in Russia and Belarus. I believe it should be a very important topic for analysis on how this actually affects the threat perception, because we know that at this day, non-nuclear weapons can fulfill some strategic missions that were previously allocated to nuclear weapons explicitly. And this means that, well, the strategic equation, to use the term coined by the Russian officials, nuclear non-proliferation treaty, well, I would go even, I would say it even more bluntly. It's not only a somewhat unequal treaty, it's basically a colonial treaty, because some countries are allowed to do what others are not allowed to. But at the same time, I understand and respect the attitude of the so-called nuclear radicals or nuclear abolitionists who call for immediate nuclear disarmament. I understand why they're irritated, but at the same time, to use the words of some of my elder colleagues, the world without nuclear weapons is not the current world minus nuclear weapons, because basically, if we move there, we will enter an era of actual global wars. Because, unfortunately, but especially since the end of the previous Cold War, war fighting became a tool for politics once again. And this is a sad reality on the whole history of mankind. Speaking about nuclear disarmament, actually, we should remember that Article 6 talks not only about nuclear disarmament, but also about general disarmament. And obviously, given current state of affairs, given current trends in military spending, we are even farther from that than it used to be several years ago. Personally, I believe what can be useful is just to issue somewhat of a P5 statement, or even a Russian-US bilateral statement, which might be harder, emphasizing that yes, nuclear disarmament isn't our end goal, but given current trends, we should first sort out the military security issues and then move there. Not sure it would be perfectly helpful, but I believe it might be like a sign of a commitment that is still there. Also, I would draw your attention to the fact that actually, with regard to nuclear abolitionists, Russia is, because although it is the only topic where P5 is united in, for example, fighting against the TPNW, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, at the same time, our former military, like Kazakhstan, is a champion of nuclear disarmament, and it is not that it affects relations between Russia and Kazakhstan that much. This is definitely not the case in NATO. My final point would be that while nuclear weapons exist, we should pay attention to the logic of their possible use, to their pathways to their possible use, and look for ways, look for opportunities to limit these pathways. And actually, this is a perfect one, not a perfect, but probably a single way to move towards further nuclear disarmament. Because as practice shows, to address this issue, to address the issue of these huge nuclear arsenals that remain, first thing is just to understand how they can be used, and then to make an argument that I would say that within this Russian debate that we are having with regard to possible nuclear use with regard to the special military operation in Ukraine, whether within Ukrainian borders. So apart from that, one of the arguments me and my colleagues use is that it makes no military sense to use, something symbolic, to use a single warhead, but to have a military substantial effects. Use should be massive, and this massive use will never help us achieve our political goals. So this is definitely not something that is advisable. Why it is also important, we also remember the stories from the US in the 70s and the 80s, where people were tasked with recalculating the targeting of the operational plans, and when there was explicit questions were asked why such numbers so quickly led to these huge nuclear cuts that we saw after the last Cold War. With that, I think I'll stop. Once again, thanks for the Strategic Vision Institute for hosting this webinar, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanovich, for those incisive remarks. I think we move on to our Q&A session. I think first we will have Q&A, question and answers from the audience sitting here at SVI. Dr. Salik will be having first question or comment. Sir, the floor is yours. Dr. Nasir. Dr. Nasir will be having my follow.
Thank you very much, sir. I think we just heard very interesting three perspectives on the global nuclear order. I would like to raise three issues, and I would request that if somebody can put us wise on that. Number one is, whenever we talk of the nuclear order, we are told that there are 9 nations which possess the nuclear weapons. But we miss those nations which have the cover of the nuclear weapons because of the extended deterrence. So in fact, that the security provided by the nuclear weapons is already existing with some other nations also, which is denied to other nations, and then once my colleague from America was saying that the extended deterrence did play a role in preventing proliferation of certain nations, including Germany. So do you think that if a similar arrangement is pursued by Russia or China to extend nuclear umbrella to other nations, can again the risk of proliferation in certain regions, especially I think in Middle East, can that have the similar effect? Number one. Number two is regarding the war which started after 9/11. The degree of violence in the last 22 years in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in other parts of the world was, I think, much more, and the people in this area suffered a lot. But the realization of the states to kind of operations which are going on in Ukraine has totally shown the double standards of the international system towards the use of force to resolve issues. So I would like somebody to put us wise on that why the international system was not responding in a similar fashion as it is responding now. And the last, I believe that the Cold War, which ended 33 years ago in 1990, probably in the operation plans of USA or NATO, it never probably ended. It continued. In fact, the potential of Russian Federation was slightly lesser to respond to what the NATO and their allies were doing, and then ultimately it came up to the last. It exploded with the Ukrainian conflict. So probably the Cold War never ended. It was just followed by the same proactive strategy of expansionist strategy of the NATO forces. And then it continued in the global South. And then finally, it ended up, now a challenge from Russia and Ukraine. So would you please help me understand these ideas?
So, Mr. Stefanovich, would you like to comment on these?
Okay, I'll start, but I believe my colleagues will also have something to say on that. On extended deterrence, I fully agree that, yes, talking about nuclear order, we need to take into account the countries that enjoy, or, well, enjoy might not be an appropriate word, but who are part of the extended deterrence relations about nuclear umbrellas and so on. And this is one of the reasons why I am absolutely confident that even if, and hopefully it will be the case, Moscow and Washington will begin proper discussions, proper talks on future arms control arrangements, we will need to take into account a lot of other countries and their interests, a lot of those. And this will be quite complicated, but there are no alternatives to that. We simply, as was said actually by one of my co-panelists, unlike in the previous Cold War, although it was not as straightforward as sometimes people say, now the relative power of both US and Russia is not as big as it used to be. So just to enforce this arrangement on global nuclear order by agreement between the two capitals seems absolutely impossible. Second, on double standards, well, I think that, of course, there is this issue, but if this topic is used too much by propagandists in many countries, I would just emphasize that one point that I previously made, the Pandora box of using armed violence to achieve political goals was not opened last year. It opened decades ago, and the question is whether it will become a new normal or will be able to move back, to roll back the tool in the political toolbox. On operational plans of US and NATO after Cold War, well, of course, there is a lot of things that NATO should have done differently, but at least some NATO countries for some period of time seemed to be eager to find some new ways for coexistence. The problem is that NATO NATO struggled with finding the reasons for their existence after the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, after the USSR collapsed. And then when Russia also got a bit irritated with the NATO policies, it was basically the easiest way just to come back to the mutual deterrence. It was basically easier for the decision makers just to follow the patterns they've used previously. This is a sad occurrence, and but I also must say that personally, everyone has their share of the blame for that. Just rolling back to the old patterns simply because it's easier. Of course, like geography is something that you cannot change, and basically the fighting the conflicts, the adversaries that Russia is having now are very similar to the situation we used to have like in 17th century, where Russian borders on the west were similar. So yeah, we can also look at it this way. Basically, it is a normal situation, but to simply agree to that and agree to the conflict that will be a reality for indefinite future is like, from my perspective, is a lazy attitude. Like, we are quite capable and intelligent people, and there are enough of those in all countries involved just to find a better way of coexistence. Yes, and that I think I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanovich, for those comments. Dr. Mariana, would you like to comment on what Dr. Nasser has just said and what other speaker has just said?
Sure. So just briefly on extended nuclear deterrence, that, yeah, the Soviet Union extended its nuclear deterrence to the Warsaw Pact allies back during the Cold War. Whether that had any non-proliferation effects, maybe in the case of Romania, but I'm not quite sure. The thing is that the extension of nuclear deterrence it's not some commodity that you could just sell to people. There has to be a genuine allied relationship that goes well beyond just the nuclear issue. So that is my fear in terms of proliferation about the countries that are neither friends or foes, right? So you can imagine some very determined enforcer of the non-proliferation regime, such as, for instance, the United States. Say Saudi wants to explore a nuclear option, Saudi Arabia, right? If, say, Iran goes nuclear, what can the United States do? It's not the kind of country the U.S. can just roll into militarily to prevent nuclear development. Nor would it really be a country U.S. could rush to offer extended deterrence to. It's just not that kind of relationship. So, and if you think about it, India and Pakistan were sort of in that same camp of non-allied, but not bad enough to be an adversary to the United States, and that creates that kind of space, right? A dangerous kind of gray zone for proliferation. Russia certainly extends nuclear deterrence. My understanding is at least to Belarus, right? If not, maybe more ambiguously to the other members of the collective security treaty organizations. Kazakhstan is a special case there because it's also part of the, Central Asian nuclear free zone agreement. So there's kind of a disconnect there. But Russia is a nuclear possessor. It has a security sort of, if not a sort of alliance of various kind of levels of security commitments to some of its neighbors. And certainly now that Russian nuclear weapons will be deployed in Belarus, or already are deployed in Belarus, that puts these forces on the target list for, well, at least, the United States and maybe other NATO countries. So those are Russian forces that will be on kind of the deterrent target list. And that's part of the Russian doctrine that if your, nuclear forces are threatened, then you might retaliate. So that actually expands that space of the operation of nuclear deterrence to Belarus now in a very real sense. Including the threats, as Dima said, that are part of that deterrent strategy. About the expansion of NATO, I don't want to delve too much into it because it is a contentious question. I think one thing we really need to recognize, it is not an axiom that everything that's happening now is because NATO has been expanding. I think it's part of the much broader picture. From the Ukrainian standpoint, and if we are to recognize that nations like Ukraine do have an agency too, right? Nations like Poland, or even small insignificant nations like the Baltic states, they do have agency. They act in the world. So it's not just for the great powers to decide who expands where, right? But these countries lobbied very, very actively to be included in NATO for understandable reasons. If you read a history of Poland, if I were Poland, I would do everything in my power to get protected by a Western security alliance the moment I get a chance, right? If you read the history of interwar Poland or what happened to Poland during World War II, I mean, history, if Russia has a right to appeal to history, so do other states, right? What we did decide in 1945 is not to use military force to change international borders for very good reasons, because we had a world war that brought all sorts of atrocities. Why? Because we tried to do that. European powers tried to do that, revise borders by force, right? And it didn't end very well. So that kind of rule has a very solid origin. From the Ukrainian standpoint, the whole issue was not so much about being included in NATO specifically, but to become a part of Euro-Atlantic space. And if you recall, early on, Ukraine had no desire to join NATO, neither public opinion nor its leaders through the 90s contemplated that. That changed gradually. I think, relations with Russia had something to do about it in 2014 when Crimea was annexed and war in Eastern Ukraine instigated. That spring, Ukraine's constitution had it as a permanently neutral state. Ukraine was recorded as a neutral state in its constitution. It wasn't in response to the change of that constitution. It was communicated through the channels to the Russian authorities at the time that is going to stay that way if you just get the heck out of our territory. So there's a lot of nuance, and all I want to do is to have us recognize the nuance. Another part of that move towards kind of Euro-Atlantic space for Ukraine was certainly political, about the kind of country and the kind of regime at least Ukrainian citizens wanted to see their country. One of the great failures of this post-Soviet transition was for a great power like Russia to fail to create the kind of political and economic model that its neighbors would want to emanate willingly and respectfully. It became a country in which the kleptocratic, corrupt elites grabbed power. The money and power is intertwined like that in a country like Russia and in a country like Ukraine. This was the model against which two popular revolutions were fought. They weren't fought against Russia. They weren't fought, Russia as an ethnical or, political entity. They were fought against the kind of system that took shape in the exigencies of post-Soviet transition because of the way privatization, for which, the Western partners were so eagerly pushing us to, privatize all these state assets. Because of the way that takes place, that wealth of these nations ended up in the hands of a very small group that grabbed the power. And for some reason, in a Ukrainian political and public space, there was a robust civil society. They said, no, we do not want that kind of regime. And one of the ways we can constrain our leaders from pursuing these kind of rents is to have actually an EU breathe down their neck and give them a list of things and say, these are the reforms you need to do. So in a Ukrainian context, the society, the public, was a very major actor in the post-Soviet space and post-Soviet transition. And of course, today, that kind of culminated in the overwhelming support for NATO membership, certainly more as a result of this war than a lead up to this war. So that's all I have to say.
We'll move to now Professor Dingli. Professor, would you like to weigh in? Please.
Extended deterrence. Surely the country that receive nuclear umbrella would be more secure. That's why so many countries want to be under the umbrella, either by US or Russia. But the counterproductive thing is that this makes country without receiving nuclear umbrella to feel more insecure. So country like North Korea that does not believe security alliance with China is credible, and they will go ahead by acquiring their own nuclear weapon. That means they don't trust their security alliance with China is reliable. This is not to China's credit. Once China has an alliance agreement, that is the only existing alliance China has had with another country, not with Pakistan, even though our relationship with Pakistan seems to be more robust with and then with North Korea, but North Korea would go ahead for their own independent development. And Pakistan does not have a treaty alliance with China, and Pakistan would go ahead with its own total independent nuclear deterrent. It's better than to have an umbrella from China. So I think this would continue, but in Hiroshima Roundtable, members of our panel suggest if we want to really have something security umbrella, what about conventional umbrella? For instance, U.S. would protect Japan with whatever at its disposal without using nuclear weapon. It's a conventional weapon umbrella. So people in Hiroshima are proposing this, reducing, de-emphasizing nuclear umbrella, but replacing with a conventional umbrella. This is a very unconventional view, idea that deserve our consideration. Second, double standards. True. The United Nations system has not devised a way for a situation when a permanent member would be aggressive. That country would have a right to veto anything to be discussed at the Security Council against such a country. Russia did, invading Afghanistan. And nothing can be passed in Security Council to stop Russia. You can discuss at the General Assembly, but General Assembly is not a place to decide how to organize the world in a military way to handle the aggression. So can do nothing. But the US and France armed Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden during 1980 to counter the Soviet military action in Afghanistan. I think China and Pakistan participated in a way. Later on, US invaded, somehow US military preempted the state of Iraq. That has a big issue of legality. And if we want to condemn the US in Security Council, US would veto. If we discuss this matter in the General Assembly, I think US may not be able to make those countries who are against the US to fail, but what the General Assembly can do physically. And we are unable to stop the US. And later on, in February 24th last year, Russia launched the special operation, quote unquote, in Ukraine. And nothing can be passed in Security Council to stop Russia. But in the General Assembly, many resolutions were passed. But China and India voted abstain. But the US and its friends got some 140 votes, Russia sometimes 5, sometimes 7, very isolated. So you can see the trend of international passion, international support, but it can do nothing. This is the weakness of the current international order, not just the nuclear order, but the major international order, which is still weak in preventing major powers of the world. Typically, they are also nuclear weapon states to launch a very controversial, legally controversial action in the world. So we need to think about how to revamp the international system. So in the future, small country, weaker country would not be suppressed.
Here, SVI, does anyone have a question? Okay. So I'm joining for this. So probably we can have an online question, and that is from Ambreen Liaquat. The crisis in Ukraine has highlighted the potential role of cyber attacks in targeting critical infrastructure. how can countries work together to protect their nuclear system from cyber threats and ensure their resilience? Mr. Stefanovich, would you like to weigh in? And I will request our worthy guests to be brief in their answers so that we can wrap it up as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the floor once again. I'd say that there are two sort of joint statement that we will not use cyber attacks against our nuclear command control communications and our nuclear weapon systems, which is somewhat complicated because now we have a lot of so-called entangled dual use systems, and the problem with that is that when you basically target someone's military infrastructure by cyber means, you might accidentally attack their nuclear part. So in a parallel track, we probably need more transparency about nuclear command control communications, which is a complicated task in itself. But at least launching these discussions can be really good on a first track. Second is a trend in opposite direction, because obviously this cyber threat to nuclear systems is acknowledged and understood in most nuclear weapon states, and it is publicly said so. We can share some sort of best practices our critical infrastructure against these possible cyber intrusions. Again, it won't be too detailed, but I think this can be a good symbolic gesture, which it simultaneously help other nuclear weapon states that might not have as robust experience as, for example, Russia and the US have. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanovich. Dr. Mariana, would you like to weigh in on this very question?
Yeah, just very briefly. Actually, the war in Ukraine highlights that it might be easier to just like lob off a bunch of missiles at critical infrastructure that, devise, some one-time cyber tool that's going to get them detected and whatever. So I think actually the good old conventional traditional force strikes back here. I'm sure there's a lot of cyber activity going on between Russia and Ukraine right now, but October barrage on Ukraine's critical infrastructure was all, very traditional and very missile based. I see a question about negative security assurance not working in the case of Ukraine. So when we talk about negative security assurances in terms of nuclear stuff, it's really an assurance not to threaten or use nuclear weapons against a country by a nuclear state against a non-nuclear country that's party to the NPT. That was part of the Budapest Memorandum. Arguably, and many people in Russia, I'm sure, would argue that Ukraine has not been threatened directly with nuclear weapons, although the September statements kind of pushed that envelope really very much. Russia is deterring Ukraine. Russia is not really deterring Ukraine. Actually, it seems that Russian nuclear threats, whether they're wherever they're targeted, even if they're targeted Ukraine, are not deterring Ukraine. They're not constraining Ukraine from prosecuting or its defense from advancing its defense. And Ukraine might be the only country today that's actually not deterred by Russia's nuclear weapons, whereas kind of Western allies certainly are. The big worry is, will there be, because nuclear deterrence doesn't work over Ukraine, there might be some extended conventional deterrence that might have been communicated by some Western states to dissuade Russia from considering the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We don't know the details of that, but they're really nothing in the sense of kind of retaliation in kind that would work to convince Russia not to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. That is not to say Russia will do it. There are probably other very good reasons not to go that way. But what I'm saying is we're observing basically the effect or how a nuclear taboo or the prohibition of the use of nuclear weapons is working in a space where nuclear deterrence is not at work. So it's a good kind of empirical test of the taboo. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mariana. This brings us to the end of our webinar. We are extremely thankful to our worthy speakers, Professor Shen, Dingli, Dr. Mariana Budjeryn, Mr. Dmitry Stefanovich, and all the those who participated. They have been in significant numbers, so we also appreciate their presence here. I hope it was a quality session. Everyone benefited from it. So thank you so much. This brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you next time again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.